Good morning, everybody. That wasn't very good. Good morning, everybody. All right. Um, want to thank Cal State University Los Angeles so much. I want to thank Kathy and Catherine for putting this together, along with everybody else that's involved. This is very impressive. Um, it's rare opportunity that representatives from the district attorney's office get an opportunity to get out into the community and get together with professionals and other aspects in the science-based field and talk to people, unless we're doing individual cases. So we're very appreciative of the opportunity to talk to you guys this morning. I got to do some acrobatics here just recently when I got pushed off the stage by Pia, but that's okay. Um, I'm still alive. So I'm going to talk to you this morning a little bit about the Conviction Review Unit, and then, more excitingly, you're going to hear from my colleague Brock Lunsford, who's going to talk about one of the cases that we worked on recently that resulted in an exoneration. So that's going to be pretty cool. So as it says, I am the deputy in charge of the Conviction Review Unit. Don't make any jokes about the shortened version of that. Um, so this, the brave world of conviction review units, or more commonly known as wrongful conviction units, kind of got started in the mid 2000s by a district attorney, elected district attorney in Dallas, Texas, named Craig Watkins. Hard to believe that this did occur in the state of Texas, but an elected official did start a wrongful conviction unit as an elected DA. And the first case that they did that resulted in exoneration was a DNA case. He actually survived a couple terms in Dallas. He recently got defeated, and is no longer the DA there. But that is the first known or wrongful conviction unit that was started by a prosecutor's office. And as some of the other speakers pointed to, included Justin, now there's a lot of information out there about and statistics about wrongful convictions, and so there are going to be a lot more studies being done and many more statistics that you're going to hear about. In fact, the University of California at Irvine is now going to be a repository, I hear, for statistics and information about wrongful convictions. So a lot of people are getting into it on the academic side, and I think that's going to be helpful for the people that are on the ground doing the work, because the more scientific-based information that you have, the better decisions that you make, the more informed decisions that you make. So one thing that we do know is that one of the most successful conviction review units in the country is the Brooklyn DA's office. And one of the reasons why they are so successful is because they have the resources to back up the great idea that they had in terms of putting together a unit like this. So they actually have New York City police detectives who are assigned to their conviction review unit and work hand in hand. They have like several teams of detectives that work hand in hand with the prosecutors and going out investigating these cases. And to date, they have had been successful in exonerating over 70 individuals so they're the most successful in doing this type of work from in-house in a prosecutorial agency. So what we like to do is talk about how Jackie Lacey, who is the elected DA here in LA County, how she came to the idea of doing this. You would be a fool if you were an elected DA and not embraced the idea of coming up with a wrongful conviction unit. Probably most large metropolitan area prosecutor's office have one now. We know that surprisingly, Texas had the first one, and now they have even more there. So they seem to be leading the nation in trying to put together these wrongful conviction units, and also those that are involved in the law enforcement agency. They actually are surprisingly leaders in rehabilitation services and programs. So they were kind of a front runner of what we already know that's happening in the criminal justice system, with a move toward rehabilitation and providing more services on that front. But Jackie Lacey decided that she wanted to get out there and find out for herself what the best practices are. So she went to Brooklyn, she went to Dallas, she went to Philadelphia, and then she came up with her own ideas of how it would best fit LA County, which is the largest local prosecutorial agency in the country. We have over 100 prosecutors who work for that office, and we have the most cases that come through our office in the state of California. So what might fit somewhere else may not necessarily fit for LA County DA, and she was mindful of that. So she came up with what she thought were the best things that would fit our office. And so we're comprised of 3 DDAs, 2 DA investigators, and 1 paralegal and 1 legal assistant, and they're over here on the right. And if they all will raise their hand, and they kind of look like those people that are on the Channel 7 conviction review, but maybe they're better looking, I don't know. But I want to please give them a big round of applause, because they do amazing work. And so how do claims come to the LA County DA's office conviction review unit? Well, we're kind of like an insurance company. We take any claim that comes through, and we document every claim that comes through. And we work very closely with several people who are our partners in this, brave world of innocence work, including Justin Brooks and all the people that work with him, and give them a big round of applause again for the work that they do. So we take claims directly from inmates. We take claims from family members of inmates, and we work very closely with innocence projects around the country, actually, that bring us information, and so we will take claims from them. When we do get a claim, we do require that a questionnaire gets filled out, and kind of like an insurance company, you have to go through the questionnaire, and we kind of go review it. And Jackie Lacey came up with a criteria or a protocol that kind of fits the best for the LA County DA's office. And so in order for a claim to be presented, the person would have had to have asserted their innocence at an early stage of the proceedings. They have to identify new credible evidence that was not considered by the jury at trial. They have to have been convicted of a serious or violent felony. They had to have been convicted via trial, and they have to be currently incarcerated. So for us, that works because, again, of the volume of cases that we have that come through Los Angeles County. And then we also, Jackie Lacey was mindful that we don't want to be the 13th juror. We never wanted to be in a position where we ourselves were second guessing decisions that were made by the original jury. So credibility calls, things of that nature, that was the province of the original jury, and we're not going to go back and second guess what the jury did. But if there's new credible evidence that a jury never saw, which can be DNA evidence, other things, then that's something that we will act on and work on, and that's appropriate for a prosecutorial unit to look at in jumping into these wrongful conviction claims. So what we look at, if somebody has pled guilty in a case, we won't look at those cases. If somebody is claiming constitutional error, our door is not the door to go through. We have an appellate section, habeas section, which is another door that they can go through in terms of pressing their claims. And we didn't want to be in a position where we were, for lack of a better word, at war with another part of our office that was handling some aspect of an inmate's claim from a constitutional point. So we don't look at those cases. We also don't look at cases where someone is claiming procedural error. We don't look at cases of self-defense or where someone is trying to mitigate or lessen their culpability for a crime. We don't also don't deal with cases where it's saying, well, the co-defendant had more involvement in it. We don't look at those things, and we don't look at cases that are in state appeals. Again, most of this is based upon our ability to handle the volume of work that we get, but also the District Attorney Jackie Lacey has said that she wanted to see how our particular unit worked. We just got started in 2015, and that the office would be willing to change the protocol or criteria as we got more information about how we're doing. So we are actually still evaluating what we're doing, and things could change in the future. So what happens when a claim comes through? We take a look at it. We try to determine whether there is in fact new and credible evidence, and if we decide that all the boxes have been checked with respect to our criteria, then we will go into what we call the consultation phase. That consultation can include working with Innocence Projects. It includes talking to the original trial deputy that worked on the case, and it includes working with the original agency, law enforcement agency that worked on the case. We think this is very important in terms of how we do wrongful conviction investigations. We frankly don't have the resources to do this work all by ourselves, and politically we think it's important to have the original law enforcement agency have ownership. If there's been a mistake made, they're the ones that the onus should be on them to look at these cases, to work with us, and come up with what the truth is. So we think that's very important. If a review becomes necessary, a DA investigator, and paralegal will be assigned. As I stated, we'll work with the law enforcement agency, and we will start doing investigation from the ground up. We're helped tremendously by the work that the Innocence Projects do, and the information that they give us. They kind of act as a clearinghouse for a lot of the stuff that we look at, and without their help and work, we wouldn't be able to do a lot of the work that we do. We can interview new witnesses, we can interview old witnesses, we can submit evidence for retesting, and we kind of work from that aspect of it. We have a committee of supervisors and managers within the LA County DA's office who ultimately review all the work that we do. We have to make a presentation to that group if we decide that a conviction merits consideration for vacating a conviction. Ultimately, it's the second person in charge of our office who decides whether we're actually going to vacate or ask a judge to vacate a conviction. He is the chief deputy of the office. The elected DA has decided to take herself out of that process so that people cannot say that any decisions that she made were made in a political vein, the smart way to do it, same thing that she does with the special circumstance committee that we have that decides who we will seek death penalty cases against, try to make it as non-political as possible. So ultimately, if it's decided by the Conviction Review Committee and the Chief Deputy that we would seek to overturn a conviction, we will, for an example, work with the Innocence Project to come up with put together a habeas letter or petition or writ of habeas that will go before a judge, and the letter that we provide is the basis for the writ of habeas corpus, and a judge ultimately makes the decision as to whether we're going to vacate the conviction. So there's an independent review of what we're doing, but in some of the cases that we worked on, and you're going to hear about in just a few minutes, we worked very closely with Innocence Projects, and the product that went before the judge was a product of both our work and their work. So that's kind of what or how our conviction review unit operates at this time, and I'm very pleased to introduce to you my colleague Brock Lunsford, who's going to talk about a real case that we did. So please welcome Deputy District Attorney Brock Lunsford.
Thank you, Bobby. And hello, everybody. I get really nervous when I speak in public. So that you all know, the people on our team that Bobby so glowingly referred to, before I walked up here to sit and be stared at by everybody, they said, don't screw this up. They're taking bets on how red my face is going to get from nervousness. So this is the vote of confidence I like before I come up and speak. How many of you, just as a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the case of the People versus Raymond Jennings? Or it's also known as the Girl in the Blue Mustang. It was a Dateline special. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jackie. I'm glad you're aware of it since you put the PowerPoint together. Let me just play a clip for you here and see if this...
I sit here as an innocent man, and this is one sin that I will not be judged for. I'm at peace in my life, and I laugh and I smile because I hold no remorse, because I didn't kill your sister. That is the bottom line. I don't ask any mercy from this court because I know I don't have any coming. I will take my time, and I will hold my head up as a man. My 5 children will know who their father is, and they will know he is not a murderer.
That's Mr. Jennings. And just so you know a little bit about me, I had no experience in Innocence Projects or defense work. I've been a DA for about 16 years when I got into the Conviction Review Unit, and half of that I was spent in gangs. So I was much more used to putting people in prison than I was to doing this. So when this case came to us, just a little background, this is the victim in the case. This is Michelle O'Keefe. She was murdered on February 22nd, the year 2000. The case was eventually filed by my office in November of 2005. It was ultimately tried 3 times, with the conviction coming on the 3rd trial in 2009. This murder occurred out in the city of Palmdale, way out where I didn't even know it was LA County, to be honest with you. It was, if you look over here on the left-hand side of the screen, this is Highway 14. This is a pretty major thoroughfare to get from LA County out to Palmdale. This is a major street. This is Avenue S, cutting east and west. This is the parking lot where the actual murder occurred. The only person in the parking lot that came forward immediately and spoke was Mr. Jennings. Mr. Jennings was a security guard on his 2nd day at work. He's not even from California. He actually is from North Carolina, and he moved out here so his wife could be closer to her family who lived in Palmdale. Up here in the intersection of these 2 lots, the X, is where the actual post for the security guard was. That's where he was at when he heard the gunshots. Down here on the far left of the screen is where the murder occurred, so the 3rd column up. And that approximately from where the murder happened up to the cross point is 115 yards. So this is actually beyond a football field. The murder happened around 9:30 at night, and what we hear from Mr. Jennings is that he started his shift, he walked the lot. As he got back up to the top of the lot where his post was, he heard a car alarm go off. He had just been down in the parking lot, so he turned back around to see what was going on, and he started to walk back down into the lot. As he did, he heard a gunshot, which caused him to jump behind a car because he didn't know what was going on. When he kind of looked up over the hood of the car, he said that he heard an engine roar. He heard the car alarm shut off, and he saw this bright electric blue Mustang start rolling backwards. And then he heard a bunch of more gunshots. This caused him to jump back behind the car. When he looked up again, the Mustang continued to roll back until it went up on a planter in the parking lot and stopped. This is the actual scene. This is the Mustang that we're talking about. This was a brand new car as a present from Ms. O'Keefe from her parents. This is where she was found at the scene. Based on where the evidence was in Mr. Jennings' description, the Mustang was parked in this stall that's up here on the upper left corner of the screen. All these yellow evidence plaques are the evidence that was recovered. What they recovered was a little bit of blood, like maybe 12 or 13 drops of blood up inside the stall, not in a different one, but actually in the stall itself. Her shoe was up in that stall. There was a gouge mark in the pavement, which later turned out to be a strike mark from a bullet. There was a casing laying in the stall. Back further, there was a fired bullet, some more casings, and that's really it. It wasn't too involved of a crime scene, except for the Mustang as you see it. That was Mr. Jennings' perspective. Ms. O'Keefe was a local girl, and she and her friend were going to go to Los Angeles that day to participate in a music video. They were going to be extras in a music video. And they decided that what they were going to do is park their car, or park Ms. O'Keefe's car in this parking lot, and then drive in the friend's car to LA, do the music video, and then drive back out to Palmdale. What ends up happening is they get to the parking lot, according to the friend, about 9:25. There's also some phone records that we had that showed that Ms. O'Keefe was on her cell phone when the car drove into the parking lot at about 9:25. She had a bright red cell phone that she was using to call Kiss FM, of all random things. As she gets into the parking lot, her friend said that she pulled up behind Ms. O'Keefe's car, breaking things, and let Ms. O'Keefe out. Her friend saw the lights of the car come on, so her friend left the parking lot. Something I probably should have mentioned, you have two entrances and exits from this parking lot. You have an entrance and exit down here in the southwest, and you have an entrance and exit up here in the northeast. The friend and Ms. O'Keefe, when they came into the parking lot, came in from the southwest and drove up here to where Ms. O'Keefe's car was parked. When she left, the friend also drove back out of the same exit, not where Mr. Jennings was up here at the top. What ends up happening is Ms. O'Keefe apparently moved her car. Her friend said when I dropped her off, her car was parked underneath this big light in the parking lot. She parked it there on purpose because of safety concerns, because she knew she was coming back at night. What ends up happening is, for whatever reason, Ms. O'Keefe moved her Mustang down to this location, which was a darker part of the lot. Also, where she parked is right next to this rather large commuter van in the lot. So she drives from a well-lit area down to a darker area and puts this huge commuter van between her and the security guard post at the top of the lot. As part of the people's case, this became an important piece of evidence because Mr. Jennings, when he spoke to the police, one of the many times he spoke, said that the Mustang was here in this parking stall the entire time. He didn't mention anything about people driving into or out of the lot or the movement of the Mustang. So, Mr. Jennings is at the scene when the police arrive. What he tells them happened is he hears the shots, sees the car rolling, and he calls in that there's shots fired. He has a little radio as part of the security guard job that he's got, I think I forgot to mention, he is an unarmed security guard at the time, so he's not carrying a gun. He's also a soldier. He's been in the Army since he was 17, and this happened when he was about 25. So at the end of the day, he calls it in, says, I've got shots fired to his supervisor. The supervisor calls the police. The supervisor comes on the scene and finds Mr. Jennings still hiding behind his car. She says, hey, come with me. I'm going to go down there where the car is. And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. You shouldn't go down there. And she went down there. This, again, was part of the people's case against Mr. Jennings, was the fact that he allowed the security guard supervisor to go down to where the murder scene occurred without accompanying her. The police, when they get there, find Ms. O'Keefe situated like this. She has her left leg out of the car, her right leg in. Her hips are somewhat twisted toward the car doors, you can see, and her body is kind of up against the seat. Her head is twisted to the right. Her left hand is down in her lap, and her right hand, which you can't see in this picture, is kind of back by her hip. There is a little bit of blood drops that you can see on her legs, and then there's some blood drops on the car frame. What you're also going to see is that there is some blood drops behind her leg. In the picture that zoom up is a little bit closer. If you look down there at the bottom, you can see that there's actual blood drops on the door frame behind her leg. There's also, when they find the shoe up in the parking stall that I told you about earlier, there's blood drops on the bottom of that shoe. So the logical inference is that she was bleeding before her foot came out of the car, and she ended up stepping in her own blood that was out on the asphalt. She also ended up dripping blood out onto the car frame. This will become important later. Number 8 is just another casing. What this ends up being is a 9mm murder weapon, and they have mixed matched ammunition. There's 2 different brands of ammunition. It's all 9mm, but there are 2 hollow point Federal brand and 3 non-hollow point CCI brand. This also will become important later. As you can see, this car was a stick shift. If you look right here, you can see the manual transmission. When they find the car, the engine is running, the lights are on, but the car is not in drive. It's in neutral, excuse me, as I go through puberty. And then right here, you have the emergency brake is down. The theory being is that at some point she turned the car on to try to get away, and before she could do so, she lowered the emergency brake. The car just simply rolled backwards. She was never able to engage it to try to escape from what was coming. The glove compartment was open when the police arrived. Also, the driver's side door was open, and the driver's side window was partially lowered. This is the scene as they found it. Ms. O'Keefe suffered several gunshot wounds. She suffered a gunshot wound to the chest, which, based upon the appearance of soot on the wound, appeared to be almost a contact wound, if not a contact wound. Up here on her face, she was shot once in the cheek, once in the nose area, and then once back here on the jaw. As you can see on her face, it looks like she's got a bunch of little red marks. That's called stippling. So that would indicate that while the gun was not as close as it was when she was shot in the chest, the gun muzzle, the barrel of the gun was still pretty close to her face when she was shot in the face. Up here above her eye is a huge gash, which is actually not a gunshot wound. It's a laceration caused by something striking her, something hard striking her hard in the head and causing her to bleed quite a bit from that wound above her left eyebrow. She, as you can see, is dressed in like going out clothes. She was told to look like somebody at a club. Her jacket was had a bullet hole in it over where the chest would have been. Her right breast was partially exposed, and her tube top, her blue tube top, was slightly lowered. This is a picture of the jacket, her tube top, her skirt. None of that had any tearing, stretching. The only damage to it, the zipper of the jacket wasn't broken. The only damage was the gunshot wound to the jacket, or gunshot wound to the jacket, the bullet hole in the jacket, and as well as her underwear and her bra were not damaged or disturbed at all. It was just lowered but not broken or torn apart. They checked for DNA under her fingernails, and they determined that a swabbing from under her left hand fingernails was a man's DNA, but Mr. Jennings was excluded as the man whose DNA it was that was under her fingernail. They found a blood stain under one of her left fingernails. Again, Mr. Jennings was excluded as the man whose DNA it was under her fingernails. Let me go back to her appearance. Another piece of the people's case against Mr. Jennings was when he spoke to the police, they asked him, well, what do you think happened? And he said, well, to me, this looked like a prostitution deal that went bad. The way she was dressed, I thought she was a prostitute, and I thought that this was just like a prostitution deal that went bad. Considering the fact that it appears her tube top has been lowered, coupled with what he said, the inference is that this was a sexual assault Mr. Jennings committed, and when she resisted, he ended up shooting her to death with the 9mm. This is a picture of what Mr. Jennings' security guard uniform looked like. As I said, Mr. Jennings stayed at the scene all night, finished his shift, and spoke to every deputy that responded out there. No one commented on him having any scratches or injuries. No one commented on his uniform being damaged or destroyed. One deputy actually said that Mr. Jennings was trying to be helpful and called him a witness. The jacket also, I should say, was tested, but we'll get to that. That night, Mr. Jennings took the time to write a report. This is his report that he wrote about the incident. He said that at 8:30 or 20-30 hours, he walks the area in the parking lot, everything's secure, and then at 9:30, he hears gunshots fired. For whatever reason, when he writes his actual narrative about what happened, he wrote that he found a few casings from a .45. That's wrong. There were no .45 caliber casings. Everything was a 9mm. The uniform, what ends up happening is Mr. Jennings works the night of the murder. He goes home. He has the next day off, and then the following day, he comes back to work, because who wouldn't? And when he gets back to work, he's working again the graveyard shift at night, and the homicide detective shows up just to kind of get a feel for the scene, how it is late at night. And he finds Mr. Jennings, and Mr. Jennings again talks to him. And Mr. Jennings says, hey, something really weird just happened. This red truck just came up, and these guys asked me, are you the security guard that was working the night of this murder? And I got a real bad feeling, so I said, no, that's not me. But I feel real scared out here. I'm all alone, and I don't think the company cares about my safety. The next day, or I should say when Mr. Jennings finishes his shift, he goes back to work, tells them, hey, I need tomorrow off. I can't work tomorrow. They said, you didn't give us enough notice, so you have to work, and he ends up quitting. This again becomes part of the people's case because he never mentions the red truck or how unsafe he felt. He said rather it was a scheduling issue is why he quit. Point of the matter is that that's a Friday when he quits. He comes back on Monday and turns in his uniform. The uniform is turned over to the police, and the police examine it, send it to the lab, and they determine that there's no gunshot residue on the uniform, no blood from Ms. O'Keefe, no hair from Ms. O'Keefe, no damage to the uniform at all. So, as this stands, Mr. Jennings is the only witness to the crime. But he says, I didn't see anybody there. All I heard was gunshots and the car rolling backwards, and I never saw anybody leave the scene. Which also makes everyone feel like, well, how could you not see anybody if you're standing up there at the top of the parking lot? Well, about 2 weeks later, a lady who we're going to refer to as Jane Doe gets arrested here in LA on a juvenile warrant. She says, hey, I know some stuff about this Palmdale murder, so a homicide detective goes to talk to her. And what she says is that me and my friends were sitting in a car right up there about 30 feet away from the murder scene. And as we're sitting there, we're smoking a lot of pot and listening to really, really loud music. And it's me, my friend, who's a woman, and this guy who we're going to call John Doe. And then my 4-year-old godson is sitting in the front seat next to me. And as we're sitting there partying, I hear a tapping noise, and I think to myself, someone's breaking into my car. Then I look up in the rearview mirror, and I see a car driving toward me from the back of the parking lot. That would be this Toyota Corolla sign that we see. And the Toyota Corolla drives toward me, It turns and I see that there is a white young guy with a red hat driving the car. And he drives out right through the murder scene. So I don't think anything more about it. And then I see a security car pull into the parking lot and decide, hey, I got to get out of here. So I drive out through the murder scene, and when I drive out is when I see the blue Mustang there, and I see the girl slumped over, and I think, oh, she must have killed herself. So I drive out of the parking lot, and when I get up to the top, there you can see that's Ms. O'Keefe's Mustang. When I get up to the top of the parking lot, I see the security guard. And this is the same security guard who was there when I pulled in, and that would be a 25-year-old black man. And you saw Mr. Jennings was the only security guard working that night. And I asked him, hey, what happened? And he said, I don't know, I heard shots. So I left, and I took my friend home, came back, saw there was a bunch of cops and a bunch of ambulance, and so I went home. That's her story. She tells the police, you can talk to my friend, and here's her name and her phone number. The police call her, the friend, and the friend gives virtually the same story with one exception. The friend, when asked about what was going on in the parking lot, she says, oh, I don't know. I was looking straight ahead talking to Jane Doe. You should ask her. She was turned around in her seat looking back at me and John Doe. Well, when Jane Doe is giving her story, she says, well, you should ask my friend about what was happening in the parking lot. I don't know. They were making out in the back seat, so I was looking straight ahead. So what you have now is everybody trying to look straight ahead, and no one wants to look out into the parking lot, which kind of starts making you curious about what's happening. The case goes to trial. The people's argument is that Mr. Jennings had detailed knowledge of the wounds that only the killer would know. They ask, how did he not possibly see the shooter? And they also say that there is nobody else in the parking lot who could have possibly done this. The defense argues this was a carjacking or a robbery that was done by unknown perpetrators. There's insufficient evidence to convict him, and Mr. Jennings did not have detailed knowledge of the crime. He ultimately was convicted of second-degree murder and received 40 years to life in prison. We received a claim from his attorney, a guy by the name of Jeff Ehrlich, who's actually a civil appellate lawyer who has nothing to do with criminal law or Innocence Project work. We received a claim on October 6, 2015, and we end up getting assigned to the case on October 26 of 2015. We review the file, which is pretty voluminous. We meet with the trial lawyer, and we all kind of have three big questions that approach us. Was this a sexual assault, or was this actually an attempted carjacking and robbery? Why would Mr. Jennings begin a sex crime and then murder Ms. O'Keefe when he's 30 feet away from a car full of people who are listening to loud music? So loud that they think gunshots or tapping noises. Finally, why would Mr. Jennings, who has no criminal history and has his own legally registered firearm, why would he then bring an unregistered 9mm to the parking lot that night? By the way, his gun was tested. That wasn't the murder weapon. It was totally different caliber. Now, also included in this claim was a MySpace page for Jane Doe. And in her MySpace page, Jane Doe writes that she's short with the light brown eyes and a Pacoima smile. What caught my attention, as well as everybody else in the unit who had also been in gangs, was the way she spelled Pacoima. In gang culture, when you are from a certain gang that likes the color red, you hate the gang that wears the color blue. And you never, ever, ever, if you can, use the letter C, because that would be supporting the gang you hate. So here, she has actually taken the time to show her gang allegiance by writing Pacoima wrong on her MySpace page to show everybody, no, I'm really down with my gang and I'm not supporting C at all. And then, if, to make sure we're clear, she just wants to date a gangster from a blood gang. So that's even more obvious. There's also an anonymous tip that the police get during the investigation where they say that the crime was committed by two gang members who tried to carjack Ms. O'Keefe and ended up shooting her because it went wrong. The gang members supposedly were in a dark colored Oldsmobile Cutlass, which is shown up here on the top. Jane Doe admits that when she's in the parking lot that night, she's in a dark colored Chevy Malibu, which, if you could see both pictures, they're essentially the same car. The gang members also supposedly said that they were worried about the man in the parking lot who could identify them. So Now we start thinking, okay, we're awfully concerned with this because we've heard what she has to say, this being Jane Doe. We've heard what this friend has to say, but what did John Doe have to say, and who is this guy? So that's when we start our investigation. Jane Doe has a pretty lengthy criminal history, lots of violence, gang crimes, lying to the police, stuff that makes you think this may not be the most credible of witnesses now that we know all this stuff about her. It also makes you wonder, like, exactly how hardcore a gang member she is, and if she's that hardcore, then who is this guy? So then we start pulling his rap sheet, and we discover that he's got some theft-related offenses. He hangs out with people from the same gang as Jane Doe. He's gone to camp in suitable placement as a juvenile, but then we discover he, as a juvenile, burned his girlfriend's house down when she broke up with him. He's found unfit and goes to adult court. And then 4 months after Ms. O'Keefe is murdered, he gets arrested and convicted of robbery. So then we think, well, what is this robbery case? Well, the neat thing is once we pull the robbery case, we discover that John Doe is a talker. So he talks not only about the robbery he's convicted of, but a whole bunch of other robberies. And they're not actually robberies. What they are is carjackings. And so what you have here is the murder of Ms. O'Keefe on February 22nd, 2000. John Doe gets arrested on June 20th of 2000. And he proceeds to tell a story about all these different carjackings. He, of course, didn't commit, but he was there when they were committed. June 9th of 2000, a carjacking. A woman is carjacked at gunpoint in her car. June 11th of 2000, a woman is carjacked at gunpoint in her car. June 13th of 2000, a couple are sitting in a car, a man and a woman, and an attempted carjacking happens. June 19th, 2000, do I need to say it? But the one that really blew my hair back was June 12th of 2000. He's convicted of this and is doing prison time for this crime right now. He uses a semi-automatic handgun to carjack a woman of her Mustang. And when he does the carjacking, the witness said, it was kind of weird because after he gets my keys, he keeps asking me if the car was a stick. All those cars that were carjacked were all automatics. There was one stick shift, and that was Ms. O'Keefe's Mustang. So, also the thing is that what we find out is that this man, the 4-year-old godson in the front seat, is his nephew. But he didn't say that to anybody, so everybody's trying to distance everybody from each other. The Jane Doe, her nickname is Taz. John Doe has a Tasmanian devil tattooed on his body. One of these carjackings, John Doe says, oh yeah, this guy did the carjacking. This is his name. We dug a little bit and discovered that guy is actually Jane Doe's uncle. So now you're thinking, well, why would this guy and this girl, who obviously are very close, act like they don't really know who each other is, and no one wants to be looking in the parking lot? So we find some other stuff about another murder that involved 9mm handguns that John Doe may have been involved in. He said he had knowledge of it. We looked at the defense claim. The mismatched ammunition would be indicative of somebody without firearms training, so unlike a soldier, because apparently when you use different brands of ammunition, you lose accuracy of flight of the bullet. The bullet strike mark in the ground would be something that should have left shrapnel marks in the pants but didn't. This was an FBI profiler the defense submitted us to consider as well. He said that the laceration, the car alarm, the property left behind in the car, these are all indicative of a youthful offender who just panics and loses control of the scene and freaks out when he does the murder. John Doe is a young guy. The killer left the purse behind, but as you can see, she's got the purse blocked off with her body, so you can't actually see it from either the driver's seat or the passenger seat, especially if you're panicking because you just shot someone to death in a parking lot. So what we asked the crime lab to do was to test the jacket sleeve for DNA, the tube top for DNA, the wristband on her wrist for DNA. And what we discovered is that the jacket sleeve and the wristband both had male DNA on it, consistent with someone trying to pull her out of the car. But there wasn't sufficient quantities to identify anybody of who that DNA belonged to. The tube top DNA, there was none. So whoever grabbed her by the arm left DNA, but then there was no DNA on the front of her tube top. So we submitted what we had to a judge. The Sheriff's Department investigated further once we turned over what we had to their Homicide Bureau, and they decided, or they disclosed some evidence to the judge that further corroborated the facts that you've just heard. And then afterwards, I don't know if you caught it, but Justin said that there was an old standard which had to unerringly point to innocence, and the judge using that standard actually found that Mr. Jennings was factually innocent of this crime. The evidence that was found cast fundamental doubt on the accuracy and reliability of the proceedings, and would tend to undermine the entire prosecution's case to the point it unerringly points to innocence or reduced culpability. So ultimately, he was found factually innocent, and where that leaves us is we know that Ms. O'Keefe has been shot to death and murdered. We know Mr. Jennings did not do it, so where we're left at is hopefully someday we'll actually be able to solve this case and say this is the person who actually did this horrific crime to Ms. O'Keefe and to Mr. Jennings. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you for speaking. I guess I'm the last presenter, right? I'm the only person standing before you and lunch, so I will do my best job to get through all the technical stuff in the last few minutes before we eat. Basically, I just wanted to talk a little bit today about post-conviction DNA testing from a laboratory perspective. We'll talk a little bit about DNA testing and its uses, what are the advantages and limitations specifically in post-conviction testing, a little bit about the statutes involved in DNA testing, and then of course what's in the future at the lab standpoint and how can it affect this type of testing. A little disclaimer beforehand is I think throughout my career I've met a lot of judges and attorneys who always say they went into the legal field because they hated science. Well, the opposite is true for myself, so please bear with me as I talk a little bit about the statutes involved with DNA testing. And lastly, I'll talk a few commercial products as we go forward, or things that we use in the DNA testing process. So, DNA, we hear a lot about post-conviction testing using DNA, and it's really considered the gold standard. And the answer is why. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences wrote a paper about strengthening forensic science, and they really talked about why DNA should be used as the standard to compare other forensic subdisciplines against. And really what we're talking about is other forensic disciplines that talk about pattern matching, where they can be more subjective, where there's a match maybe in a fingerprint, or as Professor Brooks talked about this morning, forensic odontology, which is looking at bite marks to see if a comparison can be made between dental records. This could be a tool mark comparison, and in the end, or footwear or shoe print impressions. And this type of pattern evidence doesn't provide any statistical weight to that comparison. And that's why DNA is so strong. So some other reasons why DNA is really considered the DNA or the gold standard is because it's very well studied and researched. The idea is that it was studied in the 90s, where they got groups of scientists, or the National Academy of Sciences brought scientists together to issue recommendations to ensure that DNA evidence could be reliable and accurate in the courtroom. They wanted to make sure that the principles of DNA testing were based on principles of molecular biology, scientific theory, things like statistics and population genetics. And that they outlined clear standards, beginning with DNA, that there were standards written all about analytical procedures, things like controls to ensure that the results that we give can show that profiles are free of contamination. Things like validation, so that if a test becomes online, that it's been well studied both in the community and at the laboratory level to show that it's reliable. And then, of course, things like proficiency testing to ensure that analysts that are working in the lab can show their proficiency in the type of testing that they do. And it's not something that they just take a test at the beginning of their career, but it's something that they're tested twice a year, every time as they go forward, to make sure that they're always on their toes, knowing what's going on. And lastly, the true importance of DNA testing, especially in this post-conviction realm, is that statistical weights are given to those comparisons or matches, where we're pulling out that subjectivity in general and providing a weight for our comparisons. So just to give you a little bit about what type of testing we're at right now, it's called PCR-STR testing. I know we have a lot of different backgrounds here in the room and some students, but basically, what are we doing? It's called polymerase chain reaction, and when we talk about it, it's really just a molecular Xerox machine. So we're making millions of copies of areas of interest, so that you see that little blood red stain on a dime that's the size of a few millimeters can give us a full DNA profile. It's through this process that we're able to generate results from limited amounts, evidence that could have limited amounts of biological evidence. What STR stands for is short tandem repeats. So what are we actually looking for? Our DNA is filled with these repetitive sequences. In fact, over 99% of our DNA is all the same, and there's a small percentage where the number of these repeats is different from person to person, and that's what we're looking at when we perform forensic DNA testing. Also, why it's considered the gold standard is because in the 90s, locations were established by technical working groups of the FBI so that everybody could look at the same area. So in 1997, it was decided that there would be 13 locations, or what we call core loci, in the database. And the FBI database is called CODIS. This is a picture of the chromosomes that are found in a cell, and the yellow boxes indicate the markers that the laboratories look at to determine a DNA profile. And that idea is that a DNA profile obtained in the LAPD laboratory can be compared to a DNA profile obtained from a laboratory in New York or even outside of the United States. And then you can see here at the end, of course, we also look at the sex chromosomes, and that's to determine whether a sample is male or female. What do we do at the laboratory? I'm a DNA analyst. What do exactly I do? I basically obtain DNA profiles from evidence samples and compare them to known references or known individuals. What does a DNA profile look like? It looks like a string of numbers. So if you can see here, if you ever get to see a DNA report, it's a table of the DNA profiles that we obtain. This top part indicates the name of those locations or addresses on the chromosomes that we look for, and then this bottom would be the DNA profile, or the string of numbers associated with that DNA profile. As I mentioned, we're looking for short tandem repeats. So those numbers represent the length of the repeat at each location. You have 2 at every location, one coming from your mom and one coming from your dad. And that's kind of what we're looking at the DNA level for testing. Now, why is it so great? Now we're able to, if we have a match or if we make a comparison, is to provide you statistical weight, which really gives you such that high level of discrimination. Sorry, I got crazy with the animations, but apparently not in order. And what do? We provide a frequency or a rarity statistic. We are able to give you a probability for a randomly selected person being matching that evidence profile taken from a crime scene. You can think of it in different ways. It's an estimation or a frequency of how common or rare that DNA profile found in the evidence is, or like I said, the probability that a random person could match that evidence. And the idea is that we're looking at these 13 locations because the chance of finding 2 unrelated people that have the same profile is very, very low. And that's what you'll see in the numbers that we present in court. For example, let's just say in some of the reports you'd see a DNA profile obtained from a blood stain of a knife occurs in approximately 1 in 10 quadrillion unrelated individuals. It's us giving weight to that comparison. Well, what does 10 quadrillion mean? We give these crazy, crazy numbers in court, and the idea is really just a 1 with 16 zeros. And how in court can we say exactly what that means? And we usually refer to the current world population. So if we think that there's only 7 billion people in the world, or that's how many there's estimated to be in, we realize that a quadrillion represents more than 1 million population Earths. So you can see how useful DNA testing is. The question of identification always comes into play. Can you tell me that blood stain is from a particular person? And really the answer is up to the laboratory's protocols and procedures of whether they're a laboratory that will define that. Based on the rarity of these statistics, some laboratories have chosen, well, it's this much greater than the current population, so with reasonable certainty, I'm going to identify that blood stain as coming from a particular person. There are other laboratories, like our laboratory at the Los Angeles Police Department, that just weights their comparisons using the statistics. We haven't typed everybody in the world. Therefore, we will provide how common or rare that profile is in the population and let the courtroom or the juries decide what that number actually means. So, quadrillion is just the tip of the iceberg. The way that our testing is going forward is you will start to see numbers much higher than that, even ones that are very hard to explain as we continue our testing. Right now, we reliably get rarity statistics in the quadrillions, the quintillions, and the sextillions. But going forward, I'll talk a little bit about where we're moving towards, and you'll actually see numbers in octillion, nonillions, and things going that far. Because we're typing so many markers, you'll see how rare a combined profile really is. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the advantages to DNA testing specifically in post-conviction cases. Well, the first thing that happens is when we can provide DNA analysis on crime scene evidence that was never even tested at the time of trial. So we can obtain profiles from semen stains, maybe particularly from clothing from a sexual assault, blood stains from knives or items used as weapons, and also provide maybe touch DNA samples, like things of maybe possibly somebody who might have handled a weapon during initiation of the crime. Why is DNA testing so great? It's because we can get information from really old stuff. Studies have shown that if things are stored properly and in dry conditions, we can get full DNA profiles from things like blood stains that have been stored for over 20 years. And that's why it's such a great tool, specifically in these post-DNA conviction. The next advantage is that depending on what work was done previously, there's been a lot of advances in technology. And the idea is that some samples are suitable for reanalysis because you can get more information. It depends at the time of the crime what work was done. In the beginning at the laboratories, first was ABO blood typing, and these were really fast techniques, but not very discriminating. If an item of evidence was type O blood, around 40% of the population has type O blood. So how discriminating is that? As the laboratory moved further in scientific analysis, they became a little bit more discriminating with strips like DQ alpha polymarker. And then lastly, became very discriminating with RFLP methods. And those were the types of methods used in the O.J. Simpson case. But the problem with that is you needed a lot of sample, not those small red stains on a dime, the size of the dime. You needed a lot of sample. It was time consuming. It was very discriminating, but you needed a lot, which maybe you're not going to get in crime scene evidence. So what do we have now? We do that PCR-STR testing that was really started in the LAPD around year 2000. Why is it so great? The answer is because we really see success with aged and degraded biological evidence. Well, what's degraded evidence? The idea is that DNA can degrade in certain environments, like crime scene evidence that's in a harsh environment. Things like the sun can cut up the DNA in very small fragments or pieces. Things like damp conditions can also create enzymes that actually just chew on the DNA, and that's why you're not left with a lot of information. If you think of a degraded DNA profile, sometimes in court, I talk about a license plate that has 7 digits. If we had, you can consider that also a DNA profile. But if you had a degraded profile, you might not get all 7 digits. You might only get 1 digit or 2. It's not that the DNA changes, but you're getting less information, and that's what a degraded profile would look like. That's often sometimes what we see with older pieces of evidence that we try to retest. The greatest thing about PCR-STR testing is that if previous work gave inconclusive results, now we can try to get more information. Another advantage is with PCR is because we're making so many copies, it's great for such limited sample. So initially all those small stains that were unsuitable for maybe the earlier methods, maybe now we can get some information that can lead for some information on the case. Okay, talked a lot about DNA being the gold standard. It's so great, but there are several limitations to our testing. A lot has to do with how the evidence was handled or stored or transported prior to any testing. The first thing is that the collection devices must be free of DNA. And I put a little article here if anybody's heard of the German phantom serial killer. What happened was there was this female profile that was linked to 6 different homicides in Germany. And it was only in 2009 that it was determined that that profile belonged to a woman who worked in the manufacturing site of the person who made all of these Q-tips or collection devices. So you can see there are limitations to DNA testing. We've gotten a lot better with accreditation and standards to ensure that things like that don't happen, but the idea is that we learn from this and then provide procedures or standards to ensure it doesn't happen again. Another problem could be the storage of the evidence or this old storage. Things like items of mold or bacterial growth can cause those enzymes to chew up the DNA, and that's why we might not get a profile on an item of clothing like this is a jacket with mold all over it. So if you're looking for touch DNA on a clothing item like this, you probably won't get any results because of the mold growth. A lot also has to do with handling. As I said, our type of testing is getting a lot more sensitive. So not necessarily in the 80s or 90s did we think we could get DNA profiles from items of touch. So we need to ensure that all those items have been handled properly if we're looking for touch DNA. Early in my career, I was testifying in New York, and the attorney handed me the item of clothing at court. I didn't have any gloves, everybody had touched it, and I was there to say, no, I can't touch this evidence, I can't hold it in front of a jury. Now I couldn't stop maybe the attorneys or the bailiff from touching it, but the idea is that this evidence has already been used in a courtroom and been handled by a lot of people. And I know that if there was ever reanalysis on that could compromise the future profiles that are developed from that evidence. And lastly, the evidence could be destroyed or lost. There are different retention policies across jurisdictions for how long you should retain evidence. At LAPD, it's indefinitely for homicide cases, but a disposition of evidence is also handled by the investigating officer at that time. Things, of course, can change over the years, so that's just how it can be difficult to, that the evidence could not be there when you want to retest it. What's interesting to note is, on the DNA standpoint, is this is the original evidence. Just know that the DNA process does create some work product, or what we call extracts. So there might be something suitable for testing, even if the original evidence doesn't exist. But you would really have to talk to the laboratory to see if the proper controls and things like that were still in the laboratory. Again, we're great with degraded samples, but there could be a point where it's so severely degraded that you're not going to get any information. When I worked in New York as a DNA analyst, I assisted in the identification of the World Trade Center victims, and we would get pieces of bone fragments to type, to identify, and there was a level of degradation that even these tests couldn't overcome. We weren't able to obtain those regular STR profiles because the high heat of the impact caused the DNA to degrade or to be not there anymore. And of course, another limitation is really just limited sample. There's still a limit of detection with our testing. At our laboratory, I really consider around 100 you need 100 picograms of DNA for our level of interpretation. And that really equates to about 16 skin cells. So we're still looking at small amounts. But if you're a little bit below that, you probably have insufficient amounts for us to produce a DNA profile. Let's talk a little bit about the legislature that's involved in post-conviction DNA testing. And it really is Penal Code 1405. And the idea is that the convicted person must raise a reasonable probability that the verdict or sentence would have been more favorable if DNA testing was available at the time. And there are certain requirements for DNA testing, and I want to go over a few and how it relates to the laboratory specifically. In Section G of this statute, the first caveat is that the evidence to be tested is available in a condition that would permit DNA testing. Well, how does this affect the laboratory? This is exactly those storage conditions that I was talking about, that the items are packaged in paper or boxes or not in plastic bags that could create mold or bacterial growth. That the items have been stored in a climate-controlled environment to ensure that, not high humidity or high heat has been come into play for storing those evidence. We also want to look at the evidence lockers. In LAPD, we use commercial warehouses to store all of this evidence, or property freezers. Us recent studies have shown that evidence does not need to be frozen for us to get a DNA profile, that if stored at least in dry conditions, we are still able to get useful results. So that's important to note. Some of the other statute requirements is that the evidence to be tested has been subject to sufficient chain of custody to establish the evidence hasn't been altered or tampered with. And at the laboratory, what do? We want to provide sufficient chain of custody documentation, that all the analysts have handled the evidence, that it's clearly documented, that we use even the package seals and the markings to see who's handled it at what time. Now, what's really difficult is older evidence. Procedures change, laboratory policies change. So making sure that at the time you have that written documentation of when it was tested at the time, that you can travel with the evidence and see what's happened to it. I was able to work on a big case called the Grim Sleeper case with the DDAs Beth Silverman and Marguerite Riso. And part of the problem in this capacity is that there were over 10 homicides committed over 20 years. And it was just finding and that the testing associated with all those old cases and traveling through the evidence and seeing what had been tested in the 80s and the 90s, what had been retested maybe in 2000. And it was very, very difficult for us to find. It took months and months. And then one of the last statute requirements is that the evidence has to meet the following: that it was either never tested before, or if it was tested, that the results of new tests would be more discriminating or probative in the identity of the perpetrator. And at the laboratory, that would be for us just providing the records of what was done for it, as I mentioned. At LAPD, in-house, we maintain relatively just the last 5 years of all the case records and the examination notes, but we also retain everything previously worked on, but that's in storage locations throughout the city. So it takes time for us to get those case notes and examination notes to see what was done to the case. Like I said, policies had changed. So when I was looking for, serology work done in the 70s or the 80s, back then they would store reports different from examination notes. And I had only been at the LAPD for about 9 years, so it took me to realize, like, okay, well, that was the procedure back then. Where can I find this information? And that's what was difficult. Okay, if the requirements are met, what's next? Well, the court can grant the motion on DNA testing, and now the attorneys have to agree on where this testing takes place. The statute indicates it has to be an accredited laboratory, and that's to ensure that that laboratory meets the FBI's quality assurance standards, and that's really to ensure that those results or DNA results that are produced are reliable. The idea is, let's say you have this unknown DNA profile from all this retesting. What are you going to do with it? and that you should be able to search it against CODIS or the FBI database. But if the laboratory that has to be chosen, what if it doesn't have access to the FBI database? The idea is that a laboratory is chosen specifically that a CODIS participating laboratory like LAPD has used before. And what we do is there are all these standards, but for people like me, the DNA technical leaders, they examine these laboratories once a year to ensure that they're accredited, that they follow all the procedures. That way, any DNA profiles obtained from a different laboratory, we can take ownership and then put it into the database to search. And that's what the caveat is in the statute. And then, of course, that funding is provided by the state. Okay, so what's next? You heard about all the great things about DNA testing and technology. What is the future specifically as it relates to post-conviction testing? And the first thing is that we're expanding our kits. Like I mentioned, we're only looking at 13 markers before, but as of this year, all laboratories are mandated to start looking at 20 locations. And this is to provide a higher level of discrimination. If we do have those age samples that are degraded, the idea is if we're looking at more markers, maybe even if I get partial results, I can get more information or more discriminating power if I use these expanded kits, because now we're looking at 20 different locations. So this is just a picture of the LAPD's newest kit, and these colors all represent the locations, and you can see how many are just stuffed into the kit and how we're able to get much more information. And then the last thing is statistical modeling. So one of the most difficult things for DNA analysis in the moment is interpreting DNA mixtures. So for example, if I swabbed this remote, is that the best word for it? Thanks. I don't know. I'm like, what do I call this? Okay, if I swab this remote, I could potentially get a DNA mixture of 3, 4, 5 people. What would that actually look like? It would look like a picture. This is kind of what a DNA profile looks at the laboratory. It would look like this, where you're getting many more than just 2 numbers at a location. Can the laboratory do anything with it? Oftentimes, we report these results as inconclusive due to the complexity of the data. There's just no way for us to interpret or to deconvolve this type of mixture to see if perhaps I'm the person of interest. Is Pia's DNA in that mixture profile? What would the laboratory do? They'd say, look, this is too complex for our protocols right now. We can't make any comparison. It's not suitable. But what can be done? And really it's this notion of probabilistic genotyping. It's the idea that DNA analysts aren't interpreting these things manually. It's that we're using computers to assist in the interpretation and to basically get the subjectivity out of it. So there are a couple of programs out there which more and more laboratories are moving towards, and the idea is they provide some statistical modeling. So what these types of programs do is they look at that mixture data and they run many, many iterations of what's more probable or not. Could be Pia's DNA be in there or not, and it provides probabilities or weights to how likely that is. So on data that previously might have been inconclusive at the laboratory level, there might be a way for us to actually get some information out of that using these types of methods or these types of computer software programs. The idea is this type of statistical modeling, you put in a DNA mixture profile into the computer and it can take minutes to hours of analysis. That's really not something you can do manually or at the DNA analyst level. And that's why this is so strong and so useful. And I think that's it. I just want to acknowledge both Dr. Roberts and Dr. Tellis for inviting me here today, and the California Innocence Project for letting me be a part of today's talk. My colleagues at the Serology DNA unit at the LAPD, and then of course for all the legal advice, Marguerite Rizzo, who is basically our forensic liaison, who I think I called frantically last week, help me. She was able to help me. So I just want to thank you very much.